Welcome everybody and welcome to Prime Minister to our post-budget briefing, part of our political series hosted in conjunction with our platinum partner Gibson Sheet Lawyers. Our political series and especially our events with Cabinet Ministers is a very important part of our Chamber's programme of work. Now, as President of the Chamber, you might imagine I hear a lot of opinions from a lot of people about the perceived performance of any government, in particular our current government, at any given time. And I'm going to be honest, and I will be, the reviews of our current government from many people that I've spoken to over the last few months have been mixed. And that's why I think today is so important, and that's why us hosting these events and you attending them is so important. Today is the chance to hear directly from the Minister himself. It's very easy to throw stones when somebody isn't doing what you think they're doing. It's very easy to throw stones when they don't seem to doing things the way you want. We all know that the sound bites and short articles that we consume in the media really give a full and complete understanding of everything that's really going on. So today is our chance to hear direct from the horse's mouth. No filtering, no translation is required, granted both the Minister of Finance as well as the Deputy Prime Minister. He is at the table, he is directly making decisions. So I acknowledge everyone for being here today and directly engaging rather than simply throwing from the sidelines. Or complimenting from the sidelines, Graham. It's not just important that you hear directly from the Minister, it's important that he gets to hear from you and gets a first-hand understanding about what we in the Hutt Valley think. And I know from previous visits that's something that you've really valued, Grant, is actually hearing what we think, and it's why you spend so much time on the road, not just putting the message out but making sure you listen as well. So please take the opportunity today that you have asked the Minister questions to share your thoughts with him. And I know that whether he likes it or not, whether he likes what you have to say, whether he doesn't like what you have to say, I know Grant will value hearing it from you. Now, just before we bring the Deputy Prime Minister up, I'd like to acknowledge some of our special guests here today. We have Lower Hutt Mayor Campbell Barry, Upper Hutt Mayor Wayne Guppy, MP for Hutt South Ginny Anderson, and several of our board members. So Dave Morgan, June Ranson, Tony McCone, Sarah Wilson, Joe Miller, Mike Gould, and Vibuti has sent a representative, I believe. And we also have some of our important Chamber partners here today. We have Gibson Sheet, who's our primary sponsor for today's event, and BNZ as our platinum partners. We have silver partners McCone Consultancy and Link Business, and bronze partners Red Hot Business Coach, which will be my business. We also have a table of students from Wainuiomata High. So welcome to you all. Thank you for being here today, stepping out into a brave world full of people that are not your normal circle of contacts, I'm sure. So congratulations and welcome for being here. And of course, once again, a very warm welcome to our guest speaker, the Honourable Grant Robertson, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Now, some quick housekeeping. If there is an emergency, it's the drop, cover and hold routine that we all know so well. Our meeting point is out the front door in the grass, in the car park, in the rain. And just be aware today it's being live streamed. So there's a camera, there's a phone right in front of us with a camera, and it will be sending this out to those that can't be here today. To introduce the Minister, I'd now like to invite up Cameron Madrick, who is the CEO of Gibson Sheet Lawyers and the sponsor of today's event.
Ina mana, ina reo, e reo, rangatira mā, tēnā koutou katoa. Just a slight correction there, we also have a Hutt Valley High student there joining the great team there from Wainuiomata College. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, the Minister of Finance and Deputy Prime Minister, the Honourable Grant Robertson. Today's address is part of the Gibson Sheet political series, which is our commitment to keep Chamber members involved, informed and active about matters political. Mr Robertson, as you all know, is a vastly experienced politician. He's been MP for Wellington Central since 2008 and Minister of Finance in both the 2017 Labour-led government and the 2020 Labour government. He's ranked number 3 on Labour's list, which means he is right there in the middle. He's one of the driving forces of the party and this government. This, combined with the breadth of his ministerial experience, finance we've heard a lot about, also infrastructure, which is pretty critical to the Valley, his membership and deputy chairship of almost every select committee in Parliament at some point in the future, in the past, perhaps in the future too, who knows, gives him an unrivaled insight into the key drivers for businesses. Mr. Robertson has said that his belief in social justice and a desire to see every New Zealander able to achieve their potential led him into politics. This year's budget looks to be taking some strong steps towards realising that aspiration. I'm sure you'll be keen to hear his thoughts on that and the broader outcomes that this government is trying to achieve. Accordingly, please join me in welcoming the Minister.
I'm slightly hoping there'll be a clicker here. Anyone got one? Talk among yourselves. Yep. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Hei mihi ana ngā mana whenua ki tēnei rohi, kei te mihi, kei te mihi, kei te mihi. Raurangatira ma ana hoi wha tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Good morning everybody. Just while we get the presentation set up, can I thank the Chamber again for hosting me. Mark, for your kind words and not telling any stories from our school days, which is always an important part of me being here. Cameron, thank you too for your introduction. It's great to see you here in this role. It's a role where we will continue our working relationship from previous roles, and good to see you supporting an event like this. I want to acknowledge my parliamentary colleague and friend, Ginny Anderson, the MP for Hutt South. One of, I can tell you, one of the most persistent advocates in our caucus, and a very, very strong advocate for the Hutt Valley. You're well served by Ginny as your local MP here. And Mayors Guppy and Barry, nice to see both of you here today as well. It's a good thing that when I was thinking about going to bed last night, and I thought, well, I have to make sure I stay up to see a famous New Zealand cricket victory, and so I was a little concerned about the balance of sleep versus that, versus being here and being able to talk to you articulately this morning. So the good news is the New Zealand cricket team came through for me, and I was able to get to bed at a reasonable time. But I'm sure for many of you that might have been something you would have done as well. I'm going to run through a presentation that I've been doing by and large around the country for the last 2 or 3 weeks, but I promise not to make it too long, and I promise to talk as much as I can about the Hutt Valley as well as I do it. But it has been a really interesting time. I've post-budget been top to bottom in the country, so I've done Invercargill and I've done Whangarei, and I've been in Queenstown and Hamilton and Rotorua and Kapiti and all over the place. And I think we should pause just for a minute and have a wee think about where we are as a country right now, because a year ago things were not looking as well placed as we find ourselves at the moment. And when we put our budgets together, and you'll be, where am I pointing by the way? Is it wireless?
It should be working.
Yeah. How about that?
It's working last night when we checked it.
We'll do that one, do the arrows. Brilliant. So when we put our budgets together, as most of you will know, since 2019 we've been using what we call a wellbeing framework. And that basically means that we do look at the financial health of the economy, and in the next few minutes you're going to see a blizzard of charts and numbers about where we're at from a financial perspective. But that we continue to try to look not just at that, but also at the health of our people, of our environment and our communities. It's what the economists like to call the 4 capitals of financial, human, natural and social. But actually for us it is a really important framework about saying, well, what are we going to invest in? And how are we going to measure our success in a way that is not just those narrow indicators of GDP and so on, which, as I say, I will talk about in a moment. And so one of the things that's in our budget each year now is what's called a wellbeing outlook. And it was a really interesting thing to put together for Budget 2021 because it looked back over that COVID period. One of the fascinating things was actually that New Zealanders' life satisfaction, which we measure through a variety of surveys and so forth,
actually went up slightly during COVID. And I think my view is that a big part of that was the fourth of those capitals that I mentioned before, social capital, which is largely about our trust in each other and the connection of our communities. And that is the thing that got us through COVID. And so I want to acknowledge all of you for the role that you played in that, because that is actually what we did as a country to get through COVID. So the numbers on the chart, on the slide, look pretty good there. But what they also tell us is that it is an uneven sense of well-being in New Zealand. So yes, there are things and places and regions and industries that have gone well, but there are also people who have struggled. And in particular, when we look at, and you see again on the slide there, when we look at unemployed, sole parents, when it comes to education and health outcomes, Māori and Pacifica, we have an uneven sense of well-being. And that has driven, as has been alluded to in the introductions, that has driven some of our investment in this budget, is to say, well, where can we invest and make the biggest difference, while at the same time being aware that we are still in a recovery mode from COVID. So where we're at is, relative to the rest of the world, is strong. And as I said, if you compare us pretty much with any country, getting through COVID, we've done well. And there are various indices that exist of measuring what we do through COVID, and we sit at the top of those. When it comes to a measure like GDP, that is pretty good as well. But I like probably the measure the most to note of where we are relatively is unemployment. So at this time last year, we were expecting 10% unemployment. We're actually at 4.7%. That compares pretty well to the rest of the world. Australia's about 5.5%. The OECD average is 6.6%. So that is something we can be proud of. And if I can say it, and I will, I think the wage subsidy scheme had a lot to do with that. Because what it did was it gave people cash flow and confidence and the ability to make decisions over a longer period of time. Some of those other economies that have seen higher levels of unemployment is because in that initial period, people got laid off quickly. And so having put that in place and the other support schemes that we did, it's put us in a really strong position to be able to move forward from here. And it is one that I think that just, we can reflect on for a moment before we move to all of the other questions and issues that we've got. So what you'll see there is the forecast for GDP. It's the classic V-shaped recovery with an exception, and that is that it's a bit bumpy. And that's probably my number one message to you today, is that there is still some tough times, challenging times ahead. There isn't an economic forecast that I get that doesn't include the words uncertainty and volatility. And that's what you see there over the next couple of years. And that's largely because COVID's not over. And it's an important message for us all to remember. We're moving on with our lives here in New Zealand, and that's terrific. We've done really well, and we want to keep doing that. But as a health crisis, COVID keeps going. And you only need to look at what recently happened in India, what's still happening in Fiji, what happened in Melbourne. Overnight in the UK, they're not going to lift all of the restrictions as planned in June, because the new variant that is taking hold in the UK is more transmissible, and they have not got it fully under control. And so you start to see that actually the health elements of COVID are keeping on going. In turn, so are the economic impacts. And in particular, one of those, which I know many of you will be aware of, are the supply chain issues that have been created out of COVID. They are global issues. I'll give you just a small example of how it affects New Zealand. There was an outbreak in Shenzhen, in China, not a big one, but enough for them to have to shut down a lot of what they did. It's a critical port in the supply chain. When people had to move elsewhere, that slowed down a whole lot of things, which then flows all the way down to New Zealand. And we have issues both with import and export at that point. We're really pleased, and one of the interventions we made early on during COVID was to underwrite air freight services. And we've spent about $500 million making sure the planes have actually come to New Zealand over the last year, because without passengers in them, the airlines weren't going to come. And so we've signed a series of contracts that's guaranteed those air freight routes. Still have to pay to put the goods on, but we've made sure that that's there. That $500 million investment has paid off with about $10 billion of exports going out on those planes over that time. It's a little harder when it comes to shipping. And the officials were slightly alarmed when I said, how about we buy a boat? Because we do need to think about how we do that. The boat's actually not the issue so much as the logistics around various ports and other shipping routes. So those issues exist, and they are going to continue to exist. And what that has led us to do is to try to take a pretty balanced approach to the budget. So yes, some big investments in some areas where it was needed, but also a recognition that we need to continue to be careful and balanced with the way we manage the finances, because we aren't through this by any means. As you said, unemployment, the spider on the screen is because Treasury finished their forecast for the budget before the Household Labour Force survey came out in March, so we're already ahead of where Treasury thought we would be. They were forecasting unemployment to be up over 5 at the moment, and we're down around 4.7. And I think you'll all know, because as I've been going around the country, it's back to BC, as we call it, before COVID, where people are asking me, their number one question is access to skilled staff. And so we're back where we were. It's, you know, as I said, briefly pause to acknowledge that's a good problem to have, and then acknowledge that it is an issue and a problem, which I'll come back to in a minute. Sometime in the past, I would have said that this chart was upside down, and we should turn it up the other way, but unfortunately that's not true. So this is our deficit track, our surplus track. The good news is we're trending back in the right direction, but the bad news is we had to borrow a lot of money to get through COVID. I stand by that decision. It was unambiguously the right thing to do, but obviously having done it, we now have to chart a course, I believe, back to surplus. If we extended the chart out by a year, you'd get to the projection period, not the forecast period, and we'd be back into surplus around about the same length of time that the previous national government took to come back to surplus after the GFC. And it is that level of effect that it's had on the economy, but it is a return, and it's one that I think is the right, responsible and measured thing to do. It would be theoretically possible to come back to surplus quicker, but it would require us not to invest in health and education and housing and transport and all of those areas to the extent that we are now going to do it. There's a lot happening in this chart, but it's a chart around our net debt, and I guess the news there is to be clear that we now are in a better position on debt than we expected to be. Debt will never go over 50% of GDP in the time through the forecast period. Sits a little under 40, and depending exactly how you measure it, quite close to 40. That's higher than New Zealanders are used to in recent times, and I acknowledge that. But again, it is a result of the money that we did have to borrow. And the trend starts to take us back down. But the same logic applies. If you wanted that to be your metric and to be back at 20%, where we started from in 2019, we would have to dramatically cut our spending, and I don't believe that would be the right thing to do. But we can balance it, and we do begin to bring it down. If you want to feel slightly better, my British colleague, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, delivered his budget about a month before mine, and he was able to announce net debt of 100% of GDP. And the US is up in the 80s or the 90s, and it is very high. So New Zealand remains in a competitive position. It's the reason why Standard & Poor's and Moody's have both decided that our credit ratings deserve to be where they are, and in fact Standard & Poor's lifted our credit rating, the only economy that has happened for since COVID began, and that is based on the strong fundamentals and the fact that we are in a good position. So even though it's elevated, it is still pretty good. Now, it's not a competition, but so Australia did its budget as well just before ours, and on both the growth, on all of the indicators actually, growth, employment, unemployment, the deficit, and net debt, we are in a very, very strong position relative to our friends across the ditch. And so I only put that up by way of comparison. Like I say, not a competition, but if you are talking to anyone from Australia, feel free to use it. So what that's meant for us is that we can do two things at once that I did not expect I would be able to do in budget 2021. And that is increase spending, which we have, and I'll now go through where we focus that, but also reduce debt and bring the deficit back down. And to be able to do both of those things at once in budget 2021 is a really good testament to the strength of the economy and the hard work of the people who run businesses and work in our economy. And so it is a good position to be in, but one we don't take lightly. I'll try not to go into too much detail so we've got plenty of time for questions, but the three priorities for the government are up on the screen there, and this is what you'll hear me and Ginny and others talk a lot about over the course of this term. The first and foremost is to keep New Zealanders safe from COVID-19, and I will come back to that at the end of the presentation because it is essential that we get that bit of the equation right, or all of the hard work that we've done over the last year would be wasted. But the budget mostly focused on the second two points on the screen there, the acceleration of our recovery and our rebuild, and getting on top of what I regard as the three foundational challenges in New Zealand at the moment. Housing affordability, well, I know that's an important issue in this region here, climate change and child wellbeing, and they are three long-term issues that New Zealand needs to get right if we're to do well. Always remember your audience. We're in the Hutt Valley. The Hutt Valley's done pretty well out of a number of funds that the government has put forward, the Infrastructure Reference Group Fund, and Wayne, I'm looking forward to coming out and seeing the campus shortly, which I hear is developing really well. And that investment's important, and it's something we've talked about a bit here when I've been here in the past. And you know, it's each region will always want more out of what we do, but I think these projects are a good one. One that, as I say, mentioning the persistent member for Hutt South, we have the Melling, and you'll be pleased to know, obviously, that when we did our baselining exercise on the NZ Upgrade Program, we are continuing with Melling. Slight delay, and it's only a slight delay in the start date caused by COVID and the ongoing flow-through of construction-related delays and cost issues. The cost escalations for the New Zealand Upgrade Program will not be unfamiliar to anyone trying to do a construction project at the moment. It is a combination of all of the issues I talked about before, supply chain issues, labour issues, etc. It was frustrating for us that that was the situation we found ourselves, but it was a reality post-COVID. We re-looked at the projects. Melling is still a very important project to us and one that we are getting on with. So, the first of the highlights of the budget there is the thing you will have heard the most about coming out of the budget, and that was the lift to main benefits. And as I say, I stand by it. The reference in my bio around social justice is the reason I'm in politics, but I also happen to be one of those people who was 20 years old in 1991, so you can do the maths and work out the big year I'm having this year. And it is for me really important that as a country we do the right thing by our lowest income earners. Benefit rates had fallen well out of proportion with cost of living. If lest anyone think that there's a disincentive in increasing benefits, the top rate that you'd be able to get with our increases is somewhere around 55 to 57% of the average wage. So we're miles away from it being a disincentive to work. It's also an important continuation of stimulus. So across the 4-year period, the increase in benefits is worth about $3 billion into the economy. That money gets spent in local communities. People who are in receipt of income support spend it where they live. And so actually it does act as an ongoing support to the economy. And the other highlights on there I'm going to run through now. In the housing area, as you know, we all know that this is one of New Zealand's long-term issues. We're responding in this budget to the biggest call from local government and private sector developers, which is the availability of build-ready land. So it's all very well to have projects, but if you don't have the land that's got the infrastructure, that's got the drains and the roads and the pipes, then we don't get the work done. This is a different fund to previous ones that previous governments have done. It's not loans, it's actually cash, it's actually there to get the work done and support the developments right around the country, and we'll be releasing a few more details on the criteria of that shortly. A big boost for Māori housing. Māori home ownership in New Zealand sits at around about 30%. For the rest of the population, it's 52%. That is an inequity that we need to address, and so we're focused on putting money in there, about $350 million of the Housing Acceleration Fund, plus $380 million for the building of houses. Kāinga Ora is getting into its stride as an urban development agency, whose job is not only to build public houses and state houses, but be a partner in the building of other programs, and we were just discussing some of the community projects in the Hutt here. We've given Kāinga Ora significant resources. We've fully funded its program through to 2024. It is now able to borrow more money than it ever has before to support its development, and it should be a good partner in housing over the next few years. A lot of talk in the last week around climate change, and it does remain one of the most important issues facing New Zealand. You heard yesterday the announcement around the clean car discount. That's just one of a number of policies that we are pushing through in response, in part anyway, to the Climate Commission's report. I'm not exaggerating when I say I think it's the most important document of my political lifetime in the Climate Commission's report. And if you haven't had a chance to look at it, it's a very long report. Have a look at the executive summary, because what it tells you is the extent of change that is required for New Zealand to not only meet the international commitments that we've made on climate change, but actually do the right thing for the planet and for future generations. And it's hard. Change is difficult. Change is confronting for people. But as we were saying, Joe, if you just do the same thing over and over again, you can't expect different outcomes. And that's the challenge for New Zealand as to how we do that. The sectors where the biggest change has to happen is in transport, the way we heat our industrial plants, agriculture, and so on. So I hope for any financial accounting people, the first point on the slide there is something that you'll care about and you'll understand, is that we're doing something a bit different. We're going to be recycling all of the revenue that we get through the emissions trading scheme into emissions reductions programs. So not going into the consolidated fund, but being ring-fenced for that. That's a signal from us that we know we've got to lift our investment there. The Green Investment Finance Limited is the fund we created last term to crowd in private capital to the new technological advances that are going to help us with our emissions reductions. Thinking about some of the other, Jeremy and others who are here, we've got a real opportunity here to do that, and we've given that extra funding, the 300 million that's mentioned there, and we've tagged it. So one of the things we've tagged it to is the decarbonisation of public transport, along with what we do in the waste area and in plastics as well. And so we think there is huge opportunity here, and that would be my last comment on climate change. Happy to answer any and many questions on it, is to say that while this is a massive challenge, it does represent an opportunity. It represents an opportunity to create high-paying jobs that are good for the environment and help us achieve our goals. And we want to work and partner with the private sector on that, because it matters for us as a country and it matters for us as a planet. And so we look forward to that work as we go forward from here. Big boost to infrastructure spending in the budget, $57 billion over 5 years. I've been involved in the finance area of government since about 2014. And one of the most consistent messages I've had is, where is the pipeline of work? How do construction companies in particular, both horizontal and vertical, get the certainty that they need? Well, this is what this is. And so we've created the Infrastructure Commission. Its job is to create a 30-year plan for New Zealand's infrastructure. That is out for consultation. You have just over a week if you want to submit on that 30-year plan. But what this is our financial contribution, and the bars go up the further you go out. There's a spike in 2022, which is when Treasury predicts some of that housing money will go out the door. But it is a big investment, and it's really important because New Zealand is dealing with an infrastructure deficit. We simply haven't invested enough over recent years, and this is where we think we can make a pretty big contribution in that area. Always big on rail, and I don't need to say too much more about that here. This year, though, it was the turn of the South, where I grew up, and the return of Hillside Workshops, who will now be a modern manufacturing facility. And occasionally people seem to find investment in rail somehow amusing. What I can say is it's one of the very best investments we can make when it comes to our climate impact. It's job rich, it's good for the regions, and we're very pleased to be investing in the way that we are in rail. More support for tourism and more boosts around small business, and I do, in this environment that we're here, want to acknowledge the fact that small businesses have been affected through COVID, and one of the big messages we got was around getting online, digital support, and that's what that funding is for, is the Digital Boost program. We also launched the Catalyst trading platform this week as well, and we're also looking to do more around the financing issues for small business, and again, very happy to come back to that in questions if anyone wants to. Big push again into vocational education and the reinstatement of the training incentive allowance. If I had to pick one thing, apart from the wage subsidy, one thing that we did during COVID that I'm the most proud of, it is that we made apprenticeships and targeted trade training free from the 1st of July last year. And since that time, 130,000 people have taken up that opportunity. Of that, over 60,000 are new apprentices. Of that, about a third of them are in construction. And this is us learning the lesson of what happened after the GFC, where this investment didn't take place. And when the recovery happened, we didn't have anyone to build the houses and build roads. And so that apprenticeship boost has been vitally important. We've got about 11,000 businesses who've been supported to keep their apprentices through to the end of the apprenticeship, because that also happened after the GFC. People laid off people 2 years into a 4-year apprenticeship. So that boost has been really important, and we carry that on in this budget. Just want to note down the bottom there that the government's quite busy. So in addition to all the other things we're doing, we're also entirely reforming our planning and water systems. Overdue. The RMA is not actually working for anybody at the moment, and so that piece of reform is well underway now. The Three Waters work is also a really important piece of work to give ourselves effective, efficient and safe water right across New Zealand. The changes proposed there are significant, and we're going to be working with local government on how to make that best work to make sure that water works. I live in Wellington City, enough said, so it is an important part of the reform program for this budget. Won't dwell on these too much. Health is the other area where we're completely overhauling is the health system as well, and the budget begins that piece of work. Again, very important. New Zealand, as a small country, has had an experiment with the District Health Board model. There are some good elements of it, but by and large, as a small country, it hasn't worked. We've had duplication. We don't have services provided consistently across New Zealand, so that program is important for us. In the meantime, big boost there. Budgets nowadays get talked about in billions, but I want to mention cochlear implants, just because for me it really matters. This is what helps people hear. Children, by and large, can get them quickly. Adults have ended up on very long waiting lists. This budget doubles the number of cochlear implants for adults, and that'll make a massive difference in the lives of those people. So sometimes it's the smaller things in the budget that can make a really big difference in people's lives. We push on with Chris Hipkins's major reforms in education across the board, and a big boost for Māori and Pacific education apropos of the wellbeing outlook I mentioned before. I said I wanted to come back to keeping New Zealanders safe from COVID, and I am nearly finished. We want every New Zealander to be vaccinated, but it's not compulsory. And so as a result, we need your help. And so you're going to ask some questions of me in a minute. I've got a request of you. That is your support in the vaccination rollout over the coming months. So from the end of July, beginning of August, we will be doing the mass vaccination rollout. If we don't vaccinate enough people in New Zealand, it will slow down the opening up of the borders and the broader recovery. We need this. We need to make this work. It is our route back to something like what the world looked like before COVID. We're putting a significant amount of money into it. It's free. And we will, I'm confident, meet our goal of vaccinating everybody who wants to be vaccinated by the end of the year. And as the Prime Minister likes to say about the vaccination program, it's not about when you start, it's about when you finish, because it's about getting to that point where you can feel confident about opening the borders up and doing the things that we want to do there. So we really do need your assistance and your help in that. Meanwhile, we'll keep the MIQ process going. We're opening that up for more people to come in. We recognise that immigration is still an issue for us. Because the economy's gone so well, those skill gaps are becoming more obvious. And so we are moving to see more people come in through the different skilled categories that we've got. And obviously we're looking at a reform of the immigration system as well to enable us to really see that add value and lift productivity. And then finally, in that regard, we have kept a $5 billion buffer. This is again the Scottish Presbyterian from Dunedin and me coming out, which is that even though an outbreak is less likely than it was because of the vaccination program, keeping that $5 billion back to make sure that we've got that buffer just in case, I think remains the prudent and responsible thing to do. Last point, which may be of some interest to folk in the room, is that we are doing a piece of work with Business New Zealand and with the Council of Trade Unions on the design of a social unemployment insurance scheme. These are common around the world and in countries that we like to compare ourselves with. Germany, Canada, the Nordic countries have got them. And essentially what this is about is doing what we've done in an ad hoc manner after both the Canterbury earthquakes and this most recent COVID, is to make sure that we support people who lose their jobs in a rapid manner. And essentially what it does is it's a levy-based, contribution-based scheme that means that people can keep 80% of their income for a defined period, 6 months, 12 months, and are supported to train and are required to train and retrain alongside that. It is something that I think will benefit both employers and workers. The design of the scheme is important, and that's what we're working on now. It's a genuine tripartite effort, so we're doing it with Business New Zealand and the CTU, and I've said this a few times, we wouldn't be doing it if the CTU and Business New Zealand had not come to us together and said we think we've got to deal with this. It's about avoiding the economic scarring that goes on if someone does lose their job suddenly and isn't quite ready to be able to live their lives and manage their lives through the current income support system that we have. So second half of the year, consultation document will be out. I know for small business it's an issue that is of some concern if it's another cost, but I do think there are huge benefits, and we are looking to include sole traders within the scheme as well. So we are trying to make sure it's got the widest possible coverage. So look, the budget is one that is all about how we secure the recovery that we've got underway, but at the same time have an eye to the volatility of the world that we continue to live in. So we're going to push on to try to create jobs, support all of you to employ people and give people the lives that of well-being that they want, but recognise we've got to do that carefully. And at the same time, recognise that those big long-term issues around housing, climate change and child well-being need constant investment. It's a budget where I hope we've got the balance about right, but ultimately you get to decide that. And it's one that I was very pleased to be able to present. So nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
Yeah, we have a roving microphone, I believe, Nicky. So, questions? First hand up, we'll get the microphone. Michelle, down to Charlotte.
Thanks, Grant. That was a great presentation. Really enjoyed it. As you know, I'm in public transport, marine public transport, and I'm very interested to see that you've mentioned that there. I've always said, you know, I know we're a small player in Wellington, but Auckland, the ferries in Auckland use up to 50% of the diesel that the Auckland bus network uses. And so I just wanted a bit of clarity on what input the government would have to, say, the electrification of the marine public transport in New Zealand.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy, for the question and for the great work that you're doing here. So the quickest and easiest way for me to describe it is, as I've said, we've added $300 million to that fund, the Green Investment Fund, and tagged it in part to public transport decarbonisation. So the idea is that we can act as an investor, a co-investor, alongside firms and also councils who are providing that transport. And it is a good example, a little bit of what we were talking about at the table before, of where the government's only one player here. And the way we organise our public transport systems in New Zealand means that local government is the critical player in this, along with the providers of that. And so what we see our role here as being one where we can help crowd in the capital and the support to get that going. We also set the rules, as we are through the climate change process, about what we expect in terms of emissions, which would be good for an electric-powered ferry, for example, to be able to get some benefit from that. So that's where we are with that. More broadly, within the National Land Transport Fund, we changed the rules there so that there's a higher percentage of funding going out for public transport, because a big part of what we want to do, particularly in cities like, or greater urban areas like the Wellington region, is make it easier for people to be in public transport. And the example you've got of the one we were talking about, of getting from Wellington Airport to anywhere else, is one where it's pretty obvious that if you could use the sea, it would make life a bit easier on the road. And we've just got to get multimodal, to use the phrase, transport being the centre of our policies. So that's one example through the Green Investment Fund. There's also the border transport funding that we usually do. Conveniently on the opposite side of the room.
Hi, Grant. As you alluded in your presentation, housing is a pretty important aspect in terms of moving forward and really dear to a lot of the country. In terms of the RMA, when do you expect to see any real reforms that are going to allow the freeing up of land in terms of, so councils can get on and build new subdivisions effectively and lower the cost of housing?
Yeah, I guess my short answer to you is let's not put all of our eggs in the RMA basket or in the full reform basket in that regard. So the reform process is going to take the most of this term of government to complete. But that is actually the right thing to do. I don't want to repeat the mistakes that have got us where we've got to, so we've actually got to make sure we do that right. In the meantime, we've created a couple of things to deal with your point. The first of those is the fast-track consenting process, which we put in place through COVID and we've carried on, and is particularly targeted towards housing. So we are looking to be able, where people apply into that process, it meets the criteria, to move that through in a quicker way. And we've had some real success around that, around the country, and more than happy to talk to anybody about how you can use that process as a stopgap before we do the full reform of the RMA. The other work is the work that we're doing with councils around the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, which is all about trying to encourage better quality development in our towns and cities in New Zealand, more intensified development. We've got to make sure we do those developments in line with things like transport issues and so on. So both of those processes we're working through to how we can bring those forward while we do the overall redesign. The big funding boost that we've done for housing infrastructure, we do think is probably the best contribution that central government can make, getting alongside developers. We don't need to be building those houses, but we do have a responsibility to help get the build-ready land there. So it's got to be a combination of all of those things, but you know, the RMA, I think I have to put my hand up. I think I was responsible in the Minister for the Environment's office for RMA Amendment Bill number 19, something like that. I mean, it's been tacked on and tacked on. So we've got a good process there, but in the meantime, it's the fast-track and consenting process that'll help the most, I think. Mr. Bamford.
All right, Grant, thanks for the presentation, really enjoyed it. As far as international visitor arrivals, both by air and by cruise, what is the thinking within your group of, will it be late 2022, 23, 25?
So it's going to be, Dave, it's going to be progressive, and I think that's the point. People shouldn't be looking for some light switch moment where we cut a ribbon at the airport and everyone pours through the door. This is going to happen progressively over the course of the next year or so. We've obviously already got the Aussie bubble going, the Cook Islands bubble. We continue to talk to other countries where we think we can manage a similar kind of quarantine-free travel. So we'll keep doing those discussions, and you'll see more of that as we move on. Vaccination globally then becomes the big issue, because it's all very well for us to vaccinate ourselves, but it's a two-way street when it comes to tourism. And so IATA, which you might remember, Dave, the International Transport Agency, is the group that's working on the so-called vaccine passport, but the travel documentation that will allow people to have confidence. New Zealand's at the table in those discussions. And so as time wears on and we become more confident about both our own vaccination status and that of the rest of the world, then we progressively open up, and then significantly open up once we feel confident about that. So I'm a bit more optimistic than some of those dates that you've thrown in there. But again, we're dealing with a virus that just keeps evolving. And so other countries who have been held up as the highest standard here, Vietnam, economies like Taiwan, they've all experienced recent outbreaks and now restrictions. And so it is a tricky and difficult thing to deal with, but I think the plan we've got is one that will help. When it comes to cruises, there's ongoing work on that at the moment. I saw an item on the news about that last night. I'm sure we can make some progress there if Australia is the point of departure of a cruise, put it that way.
Hey, thanks for coming out, Grant. So you talked about COVID impact on global supply, which is all fair, but I think it's also fair to say that we've had our own homegrown issues in the supply chain. So I'm just wondering if the government has any ability to either step in and help remediate issues, or even act proactively with stuff like congestion at Port of Auckland to fix that, reroute, anything like that that can help keep our economy going, because I think those supply issues has actually stunted the growth that we could have had.
Yeah, look, I don't think there's any doubt that it's caused issues for people. I mean, the growth is still pretty good, and actually our imports and exports have both held up relatively well. So people have found workarounds, but it is causing pressure in particular industries. I'm certainly not denying that. Yes, there is a role for us, and we are continuing to work with the various ports. I don't have any ownership stake on your behalf in the Port of Auckland. The Auckland Council does. That's clearly been a significant issue, and some changes have been made there. I know that a lot of work's gone on between the ports, including around using coastal shipping more to try and alleviate some of the issues that we've got. But it is a big challenge to us, and we do need a more coordinated approach to ports, particularly in the Upper North Island. We had a bit of a crack at that in the last term of government. It didn't quite turn out the way we wanted, so Minister Wood and I have been meeting about what that might now look like, and we'll have a bit more to say about that in the coming months. But the immediate issues are challenging to resolve quickly. But we have, doing our best to support the Port of Auckland, doing our best to support ships going to other ports and using coastal shipping to move those goods around. But it's still a global problem. I mean, the biggest issues are not the logistics at the New Zealand port. We've had little blockage moments, but the biggest issues are global ones. But at the moment, port ownership is a challenging issue around New Zealand in order to be able to get the nationwide port strategy that we probably need.
Hello, Grant.
Hello.
You wouldn't expect me to be silent, would you?
I noticed how you positioned yourself.
Eyeballing. My question very much features around this well-being. You've got a lot going on in this country with regard to the impact on both employers and their staff through the stresses being placed on them through the lack of resources of gaining the right people to come in and work for them. Now, the apprenticeship schemes are fantastic, but these people are not the ones these employers are needing right now. So my first question is, when can we see a bit of a light at the tunnel, recognising we've got to keep the country safe, but we also want to be able to get people in more freely that are needed. So I'd like to know when that reset button is going to appear to clear. And my second question is, the immigration system currently is a total mess. And you've got a lot of people totally stressed out in waiting for residence, and also you've got the split families. There's huge issues. Could you enlighten us a little more? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, look, I mean, I'm not going to pretend that the times, and this is a pre-COVID issue as well as a post-COVID issue, the times it takes to process immigration-related applications is good. Ginny will tell you, every elected MP in the country will tell you that this is one of the main issues that we end up dealing with. The specific and exacerbating problem we've had since COVID is that a decision made by a previous government offshored visa processing to a significant degree. So the Immigration New Zealand centres in Beijing and Mumbai not only processed applications for people from those countries, and they were our two major processing centres. We've had to close them, and so for the COVID reasons, and bring them back onshore. That whole process of doing that has slowed things down even more than they were. So that's just the very frank answer to you about what happened there. We're getting back on top of that, but it is taking longer than it should, and I can only do what I can do now to deal with that issue. Overall, that's one of the reasons why we're doing the immigration reset, is to try and get the system to be as efficient and effective as possible. We do want to see the focus be on immigration filling those skill gaps, very much as you've just described, filling those skill gaps that'll help lift productivity, that'll help actually add to prosperity. And that requires some tweaks to some of the categories. And in fairness, the previous government started some of this, looking at some of the education courses that actually were just being used as a route for people to come in here and get their student visa and then get their work visa. So they cracked down on that. We carried that on, and we've started to move away from some of that. But there's still work to do to to make sure that we get that balance of training and supporting New Zealanders into work and acknowledging that absolutely skill gaps will continue to be filled by immigration. In terms of when and how and the numbers, we've got probably around about 10,000 people through over the last, since the beginning of the year, through MIQ with particular categories, and we add to those as much as we can. We've just most recently done agriculture on top of horticulture. We've got a special engineering and construction stream, and so we are building that up. The more that we can open up ourselves to places like Australia, the more capacity that creates, and we can bring people through that way as well. So that will be progressive over time. You sort of alluded to the issue in your question, which is we have to get the balance right of keeping us safe. And I was speaking to another small business audience, and the person got up and said, whatever else happens, don't put us back into lockdown. And I said, well, I agree with that. The way of avoiding that is to progressively move ourselves through this opening. So it is going to be challenging for a bit longer, but there is light at the end of the tunnel, to answer your question.
Hello, Grant. If electrification of our transport fleet is our way out of, or is a big contribution to make for climate change management, what thought is the government doing to the generation of electricity? Because at the moment, Huntly has been on the news. I know that the Tekapo scheme is empty and we're waiting for snow melt. The Waikato and Tukanua schemes are pretty empty. We can't simply electrify everything without thought to generation. And Lake Onslow has mixed reviews in terms of its solution.
Yeah, and look, I mean, it's a fair question. In terms of the Huntly issue, that is the reality of what we have. So the system we have is built on the redundancy being provided by coal-fired power stations. It's just simply the system we've got. So, of course, we're not happy about that, but it is the way that we make sure that the lights stay on through a dry year. And unfortunately, New Zealand will have dry years from time to time, and climate change means that there's a bit of a mutually reinforcing thing there. So we, as you I'm sure know, generate more than 90% of our electricity now through renewable sources. We want to push towards that 100%. Lake Onslow is our first best idea for that, and that's the work we're doing now. Is it the only idea around how we get ourselves there? No, it's not, but we do think it's an important part of the mix. My favourite saying, which my staff are trying to encourage me away from because I seem to say it in every speech, is that the best time to plant a tree is 30 years ago, and the second best time is today. And so we haven't done that investment perhaps in the way we should have in the past. Onslow is I think, a good project, but we've got to do the work now to make it work. In the meantime, there are lots of things we can do around energy efficiency, which we are doing to try and encourage people more in that direction. The Climate Commission gives us a good guide towards distributed energy and distributed generation, which is another way in which we can support particularly things like electric vehicle fleets. If you look at Norway, the greatest country with the greatest uptake of electric vehicles in the world, you won't find many charging stations because people charge at home using the grid and putting power back in. So, there are lots of things we can do along the way, but you're absolutely right. In order for us to reach our targets, we have to be generating electricity more from renewable sources. Has that triggered you, Cameron?
No, completely different direction, new phase. This is a great snapshot of 2021 and the progress we've seen over the coming years, but it is just that, a snapshot. If we were to take off that first summary point behind you in relation to securing our recovery from COVID, what is the 2023 Labour government's aspiration? So if we look out 4 or 5 years rather than 1 year in programs, what sort of views can you offer us as a small, medium business audience about what we might expect?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, it is the nature of the job that I have that, I have to deal with the here and now and the long term, and we've got a very special kind of here and now at the moment, and that obviously dominates us. For me, it comes back to the 3 principles that I see governing how New Zealand's economy can generate good, high-paying jobs. And the first of those is cracking our long-term productivity challenge. And so That in itself, I wish it had a simple little one-word answer. It doesn't. It is about investment in infrastructure, it's about investment in skills, it's about investment in research and development, it's about building better trade links and better international links. All of those things come together to make us a more productive country. And you would have seen probably the story in the news, you know, which used to be in my old Future of Work presentation, which is that the average German worker works about 300 or 400 hours a year less than a New Zealand worker, but is more productive. Why is that? Because they have harnessed all of those things that I've just mentioned before. So that is where really our economic focus is lifting value and being more productive. Aside from that, it is about grasping the opportunity of a new era of low carbon economies around the world. We're good at this stuff, and I didn't put it in the presentation today, but we've got 7 industry transformation plans underway that go across sectors from agri-tech through to digital, through to food and beverage, and those plans are about working with the sector and with industry to do 20 and 30-year plans. What are the skill needs? What are the infrastructure needs? Where are the new products? This week is field days, and I'll be up there later in the week. And you know, for anyone who ever gets the chance to go up to Mystery Creek, it is an unbelievable experience because of the quality of innovation on show. And it's because we're good at agriculture, and if we combine that with tech, we've got a massive opportunity for ourselves, especially in the era of climate change. So that's the second area that I would think so. More productive, more sustainable, but looking for those job-rich opportunities. And then the third issue is around inclusion. And I never will, as you mentioned, I'll never back away from that. Not just because I think it's about us becoming who we think we are, which is an egalitarian country, and that's because it's the right thing to do and it's fair. But it's also, again, economically really sound. We don't get the most out of every person in New Zealand in terms of their potential contribution to our society. And so that idea of a more inclusive society. And those are big long-term investments. You know, politicians, we're asked in our 3-yearly job interview with you, to have shown what we've done. The truth is, those issues don't get solved in 3 years. They're really long-term. But stuff like investing in the first 1,000 days of a child's life, we all know that that's where you make the biggest difference. My job before I became a politician was to support researchers at Otago University to get funding for their research, and one of the studies that's done there is the thing called the Dunedin study, where they've been following every child born in Dunedin in Queen Mary Hospital in 1972. You can tell I used to market it, the most comprehensive longitudinal study in the world with a 96% retention rate, and they've now surveyed all the children of the people who were in the study as well. It is the most comprehensive study of child development in the world, basically. And I remember once asking Richie Poulton, who, by the way, if you want a really good speaker, Richie's a brilliant speaker to have along. I remember saying to him, if out of all of this 40-something years worth, as it was then, 45 years worth of study, what's the one thing you could draw from that, which is the worst thing you can ever ask an academic or a researcher? And he replied really quickly, teach children delayed gratification. And the insights that we have from that study are incredible, but alongside teaching children delayed gratification, we know that child development within those first 3 years is so important. So that's why we've done things like the Best Start policy, and it's why we've invested so heavily to support that. So that inclusion aspect will continue to be a part. So yeah, I'm not going to write the 2023 manifesto today, but a more productive, more sustainable, and more inclusive society is the one we're looking for.
Thank you.
Grant, can I just ask you one question? I don't often do this since, one of the areas that we're seeing in our confidence surveys is increasing cost on business and the cost of actually doing business. And some of that is supply lines, some of that is employment, some of that is just the adapting to our post-COVID, world, and so that drives cost. Where do you see inflation going? Because we see businesses holding their prices back pretty hard. And I was talking to someone here this morning and talking about, they're trying to hold a lid on prices now. And when we first were doing it, straight out of COVID, the businesses were looking at a 12-month window before they were going to increase prices. That window's shortening rather rapidly. Where does the government see inflation going?
So in the official numbers in the budget, Treasury predict inflation to peak up at about 2.4%, and then come down, back around to 2%. That's still within the Reserve Bank's band, the 1 to 3% band that we asked the Reserve Bank to keep inflation in. It's clearly higher than where we have been, but is still manageable. Some of the banks have it peaking slightly higher than that, but nobody's really got it over about 3. But this is pretty hard to measure, and I think I might have talked about this one other time when I was here. The whole way we measure inflation is really challenged. So we measure it largely in New Zealand through the Consumer Price Index, which is literally based on a basket of goods. The thing is, people don't shop that way anymore. You will all, I predict, do what many of us do, which is you think about a product that you might like to buy, and then you go and have a look online as to where you might be able to get it for the most affordable price. That is not actually how we measure inflation in New Zealand, and so it is a really challenging thing to be able to understand exactly what the impact is. The US saw a pretty significant spike in their last quarterly data, but most people think that that was a result of pent-up demand and it all settled. So yes, an increase. I mean, similar, you could ask me a similar question around interest rates, and that, they've been very low for a long time. I suspect from the advice I get and what I read is that they'll stay low, but inevitably, and this is not a monetary policy prediction, but inevitably they will rise again at some point. But they are so historically low that the cost of borrowing for us remains good, hopefully remains competitive for small businesses as well. But people who've taken on large amounts of debt for housing, for example, are going to be looking at that quite closely, because even that marginal difference could be quite challenging. Since you asked, Helen, I will mention the point that I alluded to around financing of small businesses, and just ask for continued feedback on that. One of the things we found during COVID was that when we opened up the small business cash flow loan scheme, it was very much the 1 to 5 businesses, the small traders or sole traders who really went for that. That scheme is still open, and so if people haven't used it, it is still open for them to use up to 50 FTEs. But that area, 1 to 5, 1 to 20, if you really want to extend it out, there still appears to me to be a gap there in terms of what banks are doing. So we had the Business Finance Guarantee Scheme. We were guaranteeing 80% of loans given under that. That scheme ends at the end of this month. And the take-up's been better than it was at the start. But again, the way in which banks are working with SMEs is something that I'm paying some attention to at the moment. I'm not sure exactly what the government's role is at that point, but I do think that there is a gap emerging there. The world's awash with capital. There's plenty of money around, but for SMEs, not necessarily that access in the same way. And so we are doing some work on that, and I really value any input that people have got on it.
Thanks.
One down the back. We're going for time. I want to get in trouble with the Prime Minister.
First of all, thank you for speaking. So I have a question with 2 hats. One, I'm on the board of the Chamber, and second, I have a recruitment business. And I have been in recruitment for 20 years, and the skill shortage now, I think, is the worst it's ever been. And that most of the businesses I work with, they're privately owned, they're mid-size, probably employ up to 60 people. And it is massive. We've got people working longer and longer hours to cover the skill shortages, which is bad for business, bad for health and safety. It also leads to inefficiency. It's terrible. So there are 2 parts to this. One is, I think there's a real risk of New Zealand losing good, skilled migrants to Australia, because so many of them are in limbo. I talk with a lot of them regularly, and it's awful. They are literally in limbo. And they came to New Zealand, they built a house here, and they don't know if they're going to be allowed to stay or renew their visas or what they're doing. So that's one part of that. The other part is training is great, and in 5 to 7 years, we're going to have some really good skilled people. But right now, businesses are screaming out for construction workers, engineering. I spoke to a young man over the weekend who works 70 hours a week as a plastics engineer, and they're doing road trips to try and get young people to work for manufacturing, but that still doesn't help him. Is there a plan to open the doors again so employers can bring people in? Most people I work with will pay for MIQ. They're fine, they're that desperate, they'll pay.
Yep, and so it's very,
Okay.
it's very much a similar answer to the one that I gave before. What it is, because we have to get the balance between continuing to keep ourselves safe from COVID and bring people in. We are bringing more people in. The two sectors you just mentioned there, construction and engineering, there are now places available, especially in the construction area, by the way. There are now places, they're not the scale that's needed, but there are now places available.
50 people, wasn't it? 60
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
They'll get employed in Auckland, just like that.
Interestingly enough, if you were to apply today, I'd encourage you to do that. So I'll just say that. But we will continue to progressively open up those places. But look, I'm in no way pretending that it's the answer, because we are in this very particular period, and I absolutely hear the same things that you're hearing. The quicker we get everyone vaccinated, the quicker we can move forward to opening up our borders and seeing more people come in. We are working with other countries as well as Australia so that we can find pathways that allow people to come in. The bigger picture issue is around how we make sure that we have a more responsive system to those needs. So I agree with you. I want to see us train more and more people, but there will always be skill gaps. We're a small country with a higher standard of living than we probably should have, given who we are. And one of the reasons we've managed that over the years is because we have had great people come into New Zealand and support us. We want that to continue. We've obviously got a particular problem at the moment, but that's what the reset's about, is saying, well, how can we make the system work much more easily? Using things like accredited employer schemes and things like that to allow people to come in much more rapidly. So I absolutely hear you. It's a huge challenge. COVID has delivered us that double whammy of borders being shut, but the economy going really well. It is what they call a good problem to have, but it is still a problem, and I acknowledge that. So you will see us move to bring more people in over the course of the year.
Minister, two final questions, one from me and one from one of our live stream watchers. I'm really pleased you mentioned the redundancy insurance concept that's being worked on. It's quite a new concept, a new idea for a lot of people. It hasn't really reached a lot of the media. I'm sure as a chamber we're going to get a lot of questions, and the number of questions is going to be, it's another cost. So yes, there's this great societal benefit, and it's going to be another cost will be the messaging that we receive from a number of members. There's going to be a lot of media. I'm sure that as the media does, it's going to produce some negative stories. Can you just elaborate a little bit now, given you've got the podium, on why this is a good thing? Why is it a good thing for the business owners and employers in this room to be paying 50% of the costs towards this program?
Yeah, and I think, the really important thing there is that just to reiterate my point, that this is driven by, in part, Business New Zealand, because it is about making sure that there is a continual flow and availability of skilled staff, and that it is easier to manage those times in the business cycle when you do lose staff, where there are reasons why you need to make people redundant, that there is a way of that being managed and people being able to come back into your business more quickly. So if you look at those other countries, like the Nordic ones, for example, it creates a much more cohesive employment market. It creates a pool of skilled labour, but it also creates better relationships between employers, employees, and the government. We're still working on the sharing of the cost model, and one of the things that makes New Zealand different from some of the other countries who already run these schemes is the number of SMEs and sole traders within our system. And so creating a system that doesn't overburden those businesses but gives them some support and opportunity is one of the design tricks that we're currently working through. But it is, obviously it's got benefits for employees as well, because we avoid that immediate economic scarring issue. But yeah, it's mainly designed around the idea that it will create a much smoother labour market for employers to be.
Thank you. And the final question from one of our live stream viewers. Grant, many people are really struggling with their mental health. As a small business, we've tried to get them help, but there is nowhere for them to go which actually helps them. We're not equipped to help on that level. What are you doing for the mental health of people?
Yeah, and that's obviously the big funding boost that we put in place in Budget 2019 is designed to do that. It was always a 5-year program, and I should look at the live stream. It was always designed as a 5-year program. The first year of it was very much around training people, getting more availability of services. Then COVID did hit, and that did delay some of the rollout of the program. We're now back into it now. We've got around about, I think it's just over, I think it's nearly 200 GP clinics where there's now dedicated mental health support for 18 to 24-year-olds. We've got the PICI program that's rolled out across the Wellington region, and now the rest of the country providing free counselling opportunities, but absolutely recognise that this is a big challenge for us. It's no longer a resourcing issue. It is now an implementation issue because that money is there. It is another reason, however, why the reforms of the health system are so important, because it is haphazard around the country as to how it's delivered. And so those things will come together. In terms of that idea of how we specifically support particularly SMEs to get access to it, one of the things that we're working on now is what's the best delivery mechanism for that. A place, a GP clinic, whatever might not be the best way to do that, and whether there's more outreach into businesses that can be undertaken. And so that's one of the pieces of work that's now being looked at, because you've got to take the support to where the people are. So, but you know, it's a 5-year program, and effectively we're only in year 2 of it because of COVID.
Thank you, Minister. Minister, I'd like to acknowledge the vast range of reforms that the government is working on right now. And sometimes it's easy to forget just how many things you're working on at one time, and how you keep track of that at any one time in your mind staggers me. Also, I acknowledge the $40 million that have gone to the Digital Boost program for business. It's a very large sum of money, and there's a lot of very positive feedback about that. And finally, it would be remiss of me not to say thank you for milling. Milling is very, very important. Look, I'm going to move on. We're coming towards the end of this morning's event. Just a quick plug for the Chamber. If you're in the room and you are not yet a member of your Chamber of Commerce, that very small monthly fee that it costs to become a member is really, really valuable to us and helps us do events like this and all the programs work we do. So that's from $23 a month. So if you're not yet a member, please reach out to one of the team and consider supporting us and the work we do. Thank you for being here. Thank you for participating. Thank you for asking questions. Thank you for listening. And again, Minister, thank you very much for being here and letting us listen to and share our thoughts with you. Thank you, everybody. The last thing of the day is a business card draw. So,
David Butler.
Butler.
I do feel I never win these things.
So we have a brilliant hamper full of locally made products. It may even be, Grant, your basket of goods for inflation index.
Yeah, the inflation on these is very
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, I've got a bunch of them all over now. Another, sit around for another few hours now.
highlights of the budget. Anyway, someone can read them.